Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at somebody very, very special indeed. So this is Nagash, Supreme Lord of the Undead. And he's such a large and imposing and impressive character that today we're really only going to focus on his weapon because I think he deserves a little bit more individual attention. So this is Mortis, the Great Blade of Death. And this was one of those items that really made Nagash such an impossible thing to deal with on the battlefields on the 4th edition. He has this one weapon. He's got the Book of Nagash as well, one of the nine. In addition, he also has his staff and he's got his crown. So these magic items really make Nagash quite a prospect to deal with on the tabletop. Already, he's a gigantic figure. He's larger than almost any other thing on the battlefield, other than a dragon or a greater demon. He is, for all intents and purposes, having stats in the realm of dragons and greater demons as well, because this is, Supreme Lord of the Undead. He's the big boy on the battlefield when you're playing with an undead army. Um, he cost a mighty 475 points. For context, a dragon was 450, and that really has him already clocking in at 4 magic levels. So he was already quite a proposition to be reckoned with, and quite uniquely, well, not entirely uniquely, but quite interestingly, his magic items are a additional cost on top of his already not insubstantial value. So Mortis itself is the cheapest of his items. It's only 35 points. But Mortis, I would argue, was perhaps the one weapon that would have been perfectly suited for a model of this kind because it really leans into his unkillability as a concept, and it kind of embodied all the things that people were typically afraid of with the undead, and it did so in a really unique and specific way, right? Mortis doesn't really do a lot to increase Nagash's damage output. It increases his strength by 1 point, sure, but that really takes his strength from a very substantial 7 to 8 out of 10, which is it's good, but it didn't really add a huge amount of efficacy to his attacks in general. It didn't give him additional attacks. It didn't reduce the chances of being defended against by a target. Although of course 1 more point of strength does reduce a target's armor save by 1. But to be honest, if you're already strength 7, you're already imposing a minus 4 modifier to armor. So to put that in context, if you've got a 2+ save, at that point you're saving at 2, 3, 4, 5. 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus save. So that's already not really something that's going to be happening very often, and that really makes a big difference to how much abuse you throw on the battlefield. I guess with that additional 1 more point of strength, you will be causing people to save on a 6, which it's a 1 in 6. It's 1 in 16 chance, right? Or rather, 16% out of 100%, and that's just a difficult proposition for almost anybody to make, in theory. No, what really makes Mortis exciting conceptually is the idea that it plays very much into the concept of the undead as a whole. What it does is for every wound that he inflicts, that Nagash inflicts with Mortis in close combat, because it is only a close combat weapon, it essentially gives him an additional 1 more wound back that he might have lost earlier back in the battle. So this makes Mortis and essentially a wellspring of wounds for Nagash. He can heal himself with this weapon, and that makes him extremely difficult to get rid of. Considering that this guy is already toughness 7 to start with, he's got the black armor of Nagash, which already gives him a 4+ save against everything in the game, meaning every time he takes a wound from any source, you roll a d6, and there's a 50-50% chance, or there's a 4+, that wound evaporates into nothingness, right? And that's a bit makes him a bit of a nightmare to deal with. Yes, you could get unlucky and theoretically fail, but then Mortis gives you a chance to get back onto your feet again. And with Nagash getting back onto his gigantic feet, that's a real problem for almost any army to deal with, right? Because he is not only incredibly tough, but he's also got a 50% chance of getting by any wound, And then this ridiculous weapon then allows you to regain wounds if you were to just simply charge into combat and outclass whoever it is that you were fighting in melee, which, let's be fair, shouldn't be too difficult for Nagash himself. So, with this in mind, I think it's a bit of a miss to do this weapon in anything other than something really eye-catching, simply because the weapon is such an integral part of why Nagash is so dangerous to face. And so with that in mind, we're going to be putting a base of Mantis Forest Green, that kind of slightly livid warpstone based color scheme, which also reminds us that Nagash's backstory, back when he was the High Priest of Khemri, and he had essentially squirreled away lots of warpstone, that magical rock that falls from the moon during Geheimnisnacht. So the Warhammer world, of course, as we know, has two moons. One of them is Sleep, the evil moon that's only visible to spellcasters. And then there's Sleep, which is really the sort of basic moon that most non-magical beings see. Now, the premise is that when most of the ill-fated events of the Warhammer world actually occur, you see two moons in the sky. One of them is the normal sort of pale yellow Sleep, and then you've got Sleep, which appears sort of green and sickly in the sky. And it's mentioned that Sleep, it's suggested that it's made entirely out of warpstone, right? That magical rock, coalesced, pure, unfiltered dark magic. And then that's essentially what makes it the dangerous thing that it is. And on certain times of day, on really unfortunate moments, that warpstone rains down to Earth in the form of meteors. And these tiny little fragments of coalesced magic go on to then, basically rain mischief down on humanity and, of course, the other races of the known world. And what Nagash did during his time as High Priest of Khemri was, Nehakara basically. All of Khemri was just a city. Nehakara is the bigger sort of land, the realm. What he did was he squirreled away all of his little chunks of warpstone that fell from the sky, and then he used these to artificially extend his life by consuming it. And the flip side of using warpstone, of course, to extend your life is that it also makes you mutate fairly uncontrollably. Eventually, it got to the point where Nagash, after assuming control within Nehakara and usurping the rule of the various kings, turned into a gigantic beast, assuming the form of the Supreme Lord of the Undead. So he is a gigantic skeleton, essentially. And this model is infamous in Warhammer circles for being not very good. But something about this sort of goofy looking giant skeleton kind of spoke to me when I was a kid. There's something really cool about the concept of an undead creature being brought to its zenith. I guess in D&D terminology, if you want to look at it. Well, I mean, we don't even have to go into D&D, right? At the point, there was a subcategorization of undead called a lich. A lich, basically, is an undead wizard who has extended his life by unnatural means, well beyond the point of being considered human anymore. He is somebody who's basically given his life entirely over to necromancy, and in the lore, necromantic magic really does take a toll on your physical form. It eventually, first of all, you lose obvious stuff like your ability to empathize with living creatures, which I guess is probably going to happen if you're going to be spending your time resurrecting things willy-nilly. And then I guess Nagash, being the extreme form of that problem, goes on to then increase his size and strength and proportion using warpstone, thereby turning this whole necromantic thing into the next level of horror, which is he's an archlich at this point, right? And there, as far as we know, canonically, there are only two archliches. One of them is Nagash, of course, Supreme Lord of the Undead. That's this boy, and of course there is the Dreadlord, which is that Saturday morning cartoon villain that was invented for Shadows of Dark Woman, which was the successor to Shadows of the Horn Rat, that computer game. So when they did it though, it was pretty clear that's Nagash, right? I mean, all the trappings of Nagash are there. He's got his black pyramid. I guess the one thing that was different was that the Dread Lord kind of rode a chariot. So maybe he's halfway between Arkan the Black, who is another famous Warhammer Lich, although not an Arch Lich. He was man-sized, but Nagash is obviously gigantic, and so was the character that was portrayed in Dark Omen, that awesome computer game from the 90s. Anyway, so Mortis is a serious part of the undead myth made manifest. The idea that undead, it represents the idea that undead are difficult to put to rest once they've risen. That kind of like esoteric indestructibility, I suppose, is really central to what makes the undead really scary, because typically undead don't have amazing stats, right? Even in any setting, undead as a rule have a tendency to be a little bit weaker, a little bit less dangerous. I mean, think of all the zombie films that you've watched that eventually go towards the idea of being more about people screwing each other up rather than zombies specifically screwing you up. Towards the end of most zombie films, zombies are kind of an environmental danger rather than an existential one. It's the PVE, I suppose. Whereas the real crux of most of these stories, the PvP part, is when players mess each other up or make use of the zombies to inflict death and destruction on each other. Anyway, so Nagash is kind of made ever more dangerous because of this weapon. Every wound that you get back is not just an average wound; it's a toughness 7, 4+ invulnerable save wound essentially, and that makes him that much harder to get rid of. And as I recall, there was something called the Arena of Death. I think it was a White Door special where they pitted various special characters against each other, and Nagash did pretty well for himself. He was fairly difficult to destroy, kept resurrecting units he didn't resurrect units. I don't think he was allowed to, but you can sort of see the difference that would have made, right? If he was able to use magic to resurrect friends, or to just use as roadblocks or tar pits so that he could maneuver himself into a better position. But alas, they did my bone boy dirty. Oh well. Yeah. As you can tell, I'm a long standing fan of the Undead. Something about the tropes that it brings to the table, it really enriches um, the game of fantasy battles, in my opinion. There's so many established tropes and aspects of undead, of being undead, that it really make the game come to life in my mind. And I really like the idea that for the most part, necromancers and evil wizards in this game really bring that idea of a scholarly path to might. Not just physical kind of ascendancy. The idea that you have a sort of intellectual path to greatness really appealing. I mean, case in point, I guess this is why there's so many stories about the whole idea of twins, and you've got elves like having twins. You've got essentially the Warhammer version of Raistlin and Caramon, right? Which will be Tyrion and Teclis for the High Elf faction. And just this idea that you've got a one who specializes in being a warrior, and the other one specializes in being a wizard. And the wizard always is in the ascendant. He's always the more powerful of the two, simply because magic is just pure shenanigans in game form, right? Like, with just being a really powerful wizard allows you to do all sorts of absolute silliness. to visit all kinds of inconvenience upon your opponent on the battlefield. You can make meteors rain from the sky. You can take over his units. You can fly around on wings of fire, all of which were actual Warhammer battle magic spells, and you could visit all kinds of like inconvenience and mischief on your opponent. And yeah, in that sense, being undead is no exception. In fact, it's an extreme form of magic, and really allowed you to do something that was quite unique. It allowed you to bring additional units into the table, and that was kind of nice because it gave the undead player something unique to do. Most undead armies, in fact, almost all undead armies, were sort of minimally equipped with artillery. I guess you did have the skull chucker catapult, the screaming skull catapult later on, skull chucker. Yeah. But generally speaking, undead players didn't really have the most impressive missile troops. So unfortunately, there wasn't a lot for an undead player to do during his opponent's turn. So the idea that you could be using your wizards to resurrect whole units and kind of just march around making a mess of your opponent's battle plans was kind of nice. It was one more way that you could interact with the game, so to speak. One more way that you could express your characters on the battlefield, and that made for some, well, I guess what I would call high fidelity gameplay, where the things that you were doing, i.e., raising the dead, were very in line storyline wise with what the undead were all about, and that was highly satisfying. And in that sense, Nagash was perfect for this, right? In fact, we'll go into more detail with his other magic items, but Nagash and his black staff really allowed him to defy the tyranny of the winds of magic. In Warhammer 4th edition, what you would have is you would have magic be an integral part, 4th and 5th actually, be an integral part of what wizards could manipulate. So every turn you had to generate the winds of magic, and in the form of in 4th and 5th it was in the form of cards. You would be dealt a number of magic cards, and this would represent what you were able to channel that turn, and you would spend these cards in order to produce your spells. Later on, with 6th edition, it became dice. That was fine as well. I mean, something about hoarding little dice on the table was kind of fun in its own way. It kind of took out a lot of the randomness of a deck of cards, but that was fine. It was still entertaining and enjoyable to use. But yeah, so hoarding magic to cast your spells was a thing. You spend a lot of time planning and scheming what you wanted to do with your individual dice or cards or whatever, and that was a part of the whole magic, like Warhammer wizarding experience, so to speak. Now, for Nagash, on the other hand, he and actually most of the more powerful wizards, they usually were able to store up magic in some way, and in so doing, they kind of escape the challenges imposed by this random generation of magic every turn. So even on a turn where the winds of magic would desert you, and your characters, other wizards would kind of be left like lifeless and without sufficient power to really channel their magic, and kind of left like flopping fish on a pier, as it were. Nagash, and of course Teclis and a few other wizards who were able to have an internal store of magic would be able to still work their mischief upon the enemy, and that was kind of cool, right? Because they kind of found a way to go beyond the challenges imposed by the game, and still justify their ridiculous expense. Nagash was extremely expensive, like fully decked out. I believe he was about 700 points with all of his magic items, and 700 points is, as you know, it's most. First of all, he couldn't even appear in an army of 1,000 points. That was too. There was a ratio that you were required to keep to. I think it was 50% for characters, and so he couldn't even appear in a 1,000-point army because he needed at least 700 points of non-Nagash to accompany him into battle, which is not a huge amount. I mean, considering that many undead creatures actually cost a huge amount of points. Wraiths come to mind. Wraiths in this edition was 74 points, I think, per model. and that was primarily because they were immune to non-magical damage of any kind, which is one of those. It sounds really good on paper, but then you run into one magic item and suddenly, oops, everything goes out the window, because without this form of protection, raids were not particularly tough in any real way. But there you go, them's the breaks, right? Such is the life of being the bad guy in the game. You have to have, you're a Death Star, and there is a weakness. There must be a weakness because the good guys have to have a chance. That's just the trope of it. But Nagash didn't have any real weaknesses, and that's what really made him kind of iconic and really scary to face on the tabletop, because this boy was hard to hurt in close combat, and he was pretty dominant in the magic phase as well. So that was pretty impressive. Sorry, I have messages coming in. I will cut this out. Yeah. So we're working on Mortis right now, Great Blade of Death, which was an appellation that I think was dropped from later versions of Nagash, because I think it was a little bit too obvious, a little bit too doom gloom gloom. So they didn't really need it. To be honest, it was a little bit excessive and maybe less parent friendly. Parents might not want their kids to be dabbling in dark magic, I would argue, but you know, having never been a parent, that's just me. That's just an opinion. So a bit more Mantis Forest Green. And Mantis Forest Green does this really wonderful job of creating a very rich kind of lurid kind of green. I think it is the perfect color to bring this weapon to life. I'm spending a bit of time doing the reverse side. And then we're going to go in with a gold wash to bring out that luster in the silver parts. Now, the other little thing is Nagash's armor is described as black. The black armor of Nagash, right? So, I think in general, Nagash is described with like most of his things are black. He was the original emo, right? The original emo clown. So there you go. So I'm not sure how I'm going to treat his armor. Well, actually, I am pretty sure. I kind of know what I want to do with his armor. I want to blacken it with Nuln Oil to the point where it's almost completely dark. And then kind of highlight bits of it to catch the light, as it were. So gold wash is coming on. For the recipe, you can check out the description. But it's essentially just Nazdreg yellow plus Seraphim Sepia to give it a little bit of extra warmth, pull it a little bit away from the yellow spectrum, which is good, but yellow is a little bit too intense, in my opinion. So I'm just going to put this on the decorations on his gauntlet over here. And then I'll come in and I'll deal with the flat bits of his armor later with Nuln Oil. So there we go. Nice and easy, nothing too dramatic. His crossguard as well. His crossguard actually has an internal sort of piece over there, which I've already done in green. So I'm taking care not to get any of this gold wash onto that part of the model. And then just blocking in the rest of the gold as evenly as I can without making too much of a mess. Although, to be fair, even if we made a mess, we can come back and we can clean it up, no issue. Yeah, it's got this really interesting protrusion of the hilt, I suppose, that rests on the blade. I imagine this is the mechanism by which Nagash sucks the life out of people that he stabs. Maybe that's the channel by which, the conduit by which he extracts blood from his opponents, kind of like a straw, like an evil metal magic straw. Very cool, very sublime Undead. And then the reverse side. I hope you can see these reverse bits. It's a little bit hard to lean in and show you, but I will do my best. Yeah. So Nagash, when I was growing up, was one of those models that I always really wanted to get hold of. but I never did. Mostly because I think there was a part of me that rebelled against the idea of using Nagash in every single game that I wanted. Something about the insane grandeur of a guy named the Supreme Lord of the Undead made it so that I didn't want to use him in every game. It didn't feel right, right? For every little skirmish to be led by Nagash. And this was something that was mentioned very much by Nigel Stillman in his early White Dwarf series about Stillmania, where he talks a lot about how Warhammer is often, an under-expressed part of Warhammer was the idea that it should be more about the characters you create yourself and less so about named characters. Named characters were there to express a certain special part of the faction lore that maybe was understated, or it helped to give players a bit of a template to understand their faction better. But it really wasn't about creating something that was uber and should be taken in every single game. Of course, this was quite opposite to what actually happened, unfortunately, with later editions of Warhammer. I think give players a tool, and undoubtedly they will use it to the utmost, right? So you often had games that were dominated by powerful special characters simply because they were so much more impressive than their peers, or what that you could achieve by your build your own character kind of approach. And unfortunately, that meant that Nagash really did lead lots of tiny little skirmishes across the old world. Every time there was a little bit of a border conflict, even every time somebody spotted a rat, Nagash would be out there with his personal bodyguard to deal with it, simply because, well, it was available to people. And yeah, I guess that's the flip side of special characters in general. Although I liked reading about them, I don't think I used very many special characters. They always seemed inappropriate for use in anything but the largest battles. But it's challenging to find like groups that held this same approach to the game. To a lot of people, especially those who were more power gamey, I suppose, had a tendency to just go, oh no, they're part of the list, therefore they should be used. And they're not wrong, right? They're not wrong. It's just, I guess, the level of immersion that you put yourself in when you play games like these. Are you playing a game essentially? Which, I mean, I would argue that you are playing a game, or are you, you know, in my mind, which is what I was doing, are you simulating something? I like the idea that I was simulating, like I was recreating a story that I read in the lore, and that meant that no, I think Nagash would only have come out for the direst of situations, or more likely when he had a plan to enact on his foes, not wandering around, like every time somebody needed, like every time the rats needed culling, I suppose. Cool. I'm gonna move on to Noun Oil, which is doing its best to evade me right now. I have to be honest. Yeah, there we go. So this is the old noun oil. I've said this a million times. Old noun oil is basically new noun oil with a little bit of Black Legion in it to darken it. And a wild ice yellow has appeared. Okay, and then I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna like block this into the silver areas. More than one coat most likely, so that it gets nice and dark. Actually, before I move on, it might be wise to take a hairdryer break. The yellow is still being a thing, so yeah, back in a bit. Hairdryer break over. Okay, so we're gonna jump right in to continuing what we were doing with the noun oil for continuity's sake, as well as because the silver's looking the furthest from where it needs to be right now. And I think this will basically be how I intend to treat the metal of the black armor of Nagash. I'm going to take it very literally. It needs to be majority black to be called the black armor of Nagash. It's going to be a really, really dark silver, but we'll call it black. I think that works. Yeah. So yeah, special characters. I thought they brought a lot to the lore. I love them to bits. I like the models that they had. You know, they were really, really collectible and cool. But at the same time, I didn't want to see them too much, which is a little bit of a contradiction, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, I think yeah, special occasions, I think, was the idea for me. But unfortunately, to be honest, over the course of playing this game for as long as we did, we ended up not using special characters, and I think we kind of went the opposite way, which to my mind was actually also not ideal because we I mean at some point it became taboo to use special characters because they were well just so dominating in the sizes of games that we tended to play. So unfortunately, they never actually made an appearance, and I think that's the problem, right? Because we identified an issue with the status quo. We enacted kind of an unspoken rule, and as is so often the case, we just got comfortable with it, and we never really changed it, to be perfectly honest, and we never really re-interrogated our reasons for not wanting special characters on the battlefield. And that was a little bit of a shame because these models were great. They were particularly special for a reason, and yeah, you could still use them to represent like regular models of their kind. But in the case of Nagash, unfortunately, there's no other analog for this kind of creature. There's no other giant undead dude. So Nagash never saw the table, and as a result, I never really saw a function for Nagash on the table. Therefore, I never bought Nagash, and therefore I never painted Nagash, and therefore this whole experience of painting Nagash is the first time I'm doing it, and it's kind of awesome because this model, despite the fact that he looks like a killer clown, right? Let's be fair. This model has all sorts of things wrong with it. Just visually, there's a whole like fascinating story, but you know what? I love this model still, and you cannot change my mind on it. I think it's a piece of Warhammer like history. It's so unique and so different that you kind of have to discuss it every time you talk about grand old uh, Warhammer miniatures. Nagash definitely needs to be, you know, like on the cards to be discussed because it's so unique and special. And the reasons why people didn't like it at the time are completely valid. But I think we've been in this hobby for long enough that now a lot of it has given way to nostalgia slightly. And although this model doesn't have a lot of users in modern Warhammer, I believe it still has a place in my collection. Or it has pride of place in my collection, if it were. Mostly because I don't really play the games that much anymore, but also because this was such a a seminal memory of mine when I was growing up. Yeah. So just to catch you up a little bit on the painting, this is ice yellow, mixed into Mantis Warriors green, to get this really nice lurid green color. And I think the last thing I want to do is to come back and deepen the green further with a bit of Ildari Emerald. So this is a bluish green that takes the green that until this point has kind of been like a yellow green, I suppose. Takes it in a new direction, which I like the idea of. Um, as always, when choosing colors, it's always a good idea to make sure that you pull the color scheme in different directions. So you can start with a like with a warm green, like Mantis Warriors green most definitely is, but then coming back in with a cold green like Ildari Emerald, a really intense bilious green, is great because visually this transition between like warm and cold tones is readily picked up by our eyes, and we appreciate the difference quite easily. Even if you don't use a massive amount of this color, a small amount goes a long way to expressing that vibe, and it works really well for shading. And you can pick it up, even if it doesn't, even if it's not a huge part of your color scheme. Like I said, visually we do read it, and we, of course, it helps us draw attention to the business end of the blade, right? So painting swords is interesting as well, right? Because painting swords are not the best structures for 3D sculpting. I think you agree, or sculpting in general, because swords have a taper to them. So the blade is not naturally where your eye gets focused. So to a certain extent, fantasy swords avoid this problem because fantasy swords tend to be sculpted with a lot of flair and a lot of like detail. So your eye does get drawn towards the extremities because they're so outlandish and interestingly shaped. But it helps, I think, to find ways to emphasize the sword. So with a sword as important as Mortis, to the lore and to the whole general unkillability of Nagash, his backstory and so on. Because Nagash has come back from the dead many, many times, right? Yeah. So it helps to adopt a painting style that helps it to rise up visually, even amongst a very crowded color scheme. I know you can't tell how crowded Nagash is going to be, but trust me, once we paint in all the details, this boy is going to be crowded AF. So basically, using a color scheme that really isn't going to like occur anywhere else on the miniature, right? Like I don't foresee myself using this shade of green in any real way on any other parts of the model. Maybe the occasional gemstone, maybe. Like I said, it's usually a good idea to try to repeat colors somewhere, keep the palette relatively restrained and controlled, and use a color that, is intended to draw the eye. Have a color that's basically set aside for you to draw the eye to important parts of the model. In this case, it's going to be green, of course. Now that Mortis's blade is green, it kind of begs for anything significant to be painted green as well. But you don't want to use it too much because then it becomes really overwhelming and a little bit too much for the overall color scheme. So yeah, Mortis is looking pretty good in my opinion. I'm very tempted to go all the way up to white for the sword blade. I think I probably will, simply because this is one of the rare cases where it's so important to draw the eye to the tip of the sword that I believe it's necessary. Even so, I've got pure white and I'm mixing a little bit of ice yellow into it. I don't want to go to straight white, to pure white, because I think that takes some of the color out of the model. But we can go very, very close, and this is only going to be on the absolute tip of the weapon. To be honest with you, I'm finding these funny little divots along the blade a bit of a distraction, but it's okay. We'll work with them. It's an old model, and therefore it gets to be exactly how it is. We are maintaining the integrity of the model as best we can, and really just showing it off in its best light, even though there are elements of it which are a little bit odd, but that's fine. These old models have earned their place in the sun, so to speak. Especially Nagash, which got a lot of abuse, unfortunately. I think Nagash. I think like Games Workshop was very proud of Nagash for a very long time because he kept appearing on a lot of the artwork and covers of their most important books. So, for example, the painting guides would have pictures of Nagash, and I think they went from being really proud of Nagash as a whole to being slightly embarrassed by him. as kind of tastes and sculpting ability moved on, technology changed. Nagash started looking really, really dated, unfortunately, and this poor boy was done dirty. And it's still making the rounds across YouTube. Like, people are still making fun of this guy, which is really unfortunate because, you know, if you know the backstory of this miniature and how it was sculpted by Gary Morley, and there was a lot of interference by other sculptors. Well, not other sculptors, by the powers that be in the company. Essentially, Gary Morley had to resculpt large areas of this model because everybody wanted something that was even more dramatic. So the fact that Gary Morley gets a lot of hate for this model, despite the fact that this wasn't his original vision of the model, kind of unfair in my opinion. And he's a wonderful guy, right? Like Gary Morley, and a really good sculptor in his way. To be honest, Gary Morley did all of the early Blood Bowl miniatures, and yes, they're a bit dated, but Gary Morley did all of them, like all of the Blood Bowl team boxes, and those are really close to my heart. You know, these models, they may not have been the best, but they have a charm to them, and they have a style, and that's a lot in my book. So yeah, that's Nagash's Great Blade Mortis death. There's a lot of bullshit left in Warhammer, but yeah, that's this guy. Very, very pleased with the way he's turned out. I'm just going to clean up a little bit around the edges to show him off a little bit better. But yeah, we're going to be moving on to his next magic item. More than likely, either the Book of Nagash or the Staff. I think the Staff has to be next because look at it, it's so impressive. I'm just going to glaze a little bit more green to even out the blade slightly and have a little bit less of the white showing. I like the white, it's just very, very strong. And just have more of that blend along the length of the blade. There we go. Okay guys, thanks for joining me on this. Here's a closer look. Not too close, I hope. Let me put this away. And I hope you enjoyed painting Mortis on Nagash with me. We're going to be moving on to other parts of Nagash now. Alright then, have a good one. Cheers!